going to talk about a fascinating subject, repeating patterns. This is something that not only can be observable in economics and, politics, perhaps, but it's also instilled into in nature by our Creator. Repeating patterns is something that King Solomon wrote about 3,500 years ago, and I want to quote this. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done again. And there is nothing new under the sun. It has already been done in ancient times before us. Isn't that remarkable? Did you ever read that in the Bible? It's there, so look it up. Solomon was purportedly the wisest man who ever lived, and God gave him insights about, beyond our perception of things. He saw in nature and in the creation and in time, space, this place we live on planet Earth, he saw that there were repeating patterns. And tonight, I am delighted to have a special guest join us, Ken Schortgen, a prolific author, an economist, someone who's done podcasting for years. Even I'm getting started, but he's done it for a long time. He's done international podcasting. And the thing that attracted me to his work was that he observed that over time, in every century, every 100 years, we see a repeating pattern with the things that are part of life, the building of empires, economics, social constructs, politics, even the church. The church goes through repeating patterns. But anyway, I wanted to invite him on because I find this a fascinating subject, and I think it just dovetails, it dovetails right into prophetic voices that are out in the land who have no clue about repeating patterns. But without further ado, let's just bring him on. Ken, are you there tonight?
Good evening, Janet. Hopefully things are going well with you.
They're going very well with me, and I'm excited to have you on board tonight and to hear some of the insights that you may have. I looked at some of the notes that I took down from your podcasts, your previous ones and that, and it's just phenomenal how so many things have a repeating pattern, which led me to believe that God is the author of repeating patterns. So I don't know what's a good place to start, but I know that you have been doing some research on a couple of books from the 20th century. Would you share those with us tonight?
Well, more than anything, I'll lay the foundation for what we see in repeating patterns, in cycles, things like that.
Okay.
Obviously, the Bible speaks on different generations. That they are in part cycles: 20-year, 30-year, 40-year, 50-year, 70-year, 100-year. They are in reference to something specific. The other thing with cycles is nature obviously has 4 seasons. Those are considered cycles.
Yes, exactly.
And because nature has that, there is also a cycle of human civilization. And it was, you go back to Pythagoras, he saw the patterns in things like the numerology. Fibonacci saw the patterns in his famous mathematical equations.
Oh yes, and that affects music. Yeah, absolutely.
Then we have, in the 1970s, a book came out called Future Shock, Alvin Toffler, forecasting what was going to happen for the rest of the century. But in the 1997, a book that is really pertinent to today came out from 2 historians named Howe and Strauss. And the book was called The Fourth Turning. And what this is about is that there are historical cycles in that are tied to the life of a human, roughly 80 to 100 years. The cycles can change in perspective. Normally, they're between 20 and 25 years.
Mhm.
Sometimes they can go as much as 30. Sometimes they can go less than that. But it's roughly that amount. And there are 4 cycles in the course of every century. The first one that usually starts at the beginning of the century is the crisis mode. And these talk about things that have changes with economics, morality, religion, empire, history, things like that.
Mhm.
That is followed by the first turning of the American high. We see this last century at the times of Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy. America was at its greatest point. The American citizen was at the highest standard of living.
Yes.
America was #1 in the world superpower. Even though there was an opposition, the U.S. would eventually go on to become the world's hegemonic leader
Yes.
and become empire. And we took over that position from the British Empire in the 1940s.
Oh, let me interject here a minute. You know, you're talking about actually time periods that I know I lived in, and you were born into the 20th century also. And I remember I was born at the end of World War II, so I didn't know what that period was like. But my childhood was magical. I grew up in the 1950s as a little girl, as a child growing into my teen years. Life then was like, you know, out of a storybook. And I think that's part of what you were saying. It was the high period of that century. And I was fortunate enough to be living in that time. So after that, though, I do remember being part of the 60s, and it was utter chaos and rebellion. So go ahead. I didn't mean to stop you, but I was just thinking about, as you're speaking, you know, I can see this, and I know that many of the listeners can relate to that as well.
Each of the different cycles, in this case, the first turning, the American high, or the high of an empire, any empire, if you look hard enough, you start to find the cracks that will lead to undermining it over the next 50, 60 years.
Mhm.
Even though things were so great, we had the Cold War, we had the threat of nuclear
Mhm.
annihilation.
Oh, yeah.
We had Jim Crow laws in the South.
And
There
we
was
had
still
many
civil unrest.
assassinations during that time. Yeah, I agree.
Well, those cracks are what leads to the second turning, which is the consciousness revolution. We saw this across university campuses, the revolts of the mid-60s, the civil rights era. Even going into the 1980s, we saw the tax revolts of the 1980s, the inflation that led to in 80 almost a ditching of the dollar as gold prices shot up, silver prices shot up at that time. And then that unraveling is usually stopped as it shifts into the next point. The third turning is about the culture wars, an era that began with Reagan's mid-1980s. Even though the Reagan years, the Democrats and the Republicans were in opposition to each other, there was at least a propriety that they followed. There wasn't the utter hatred that we see in politics today.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
But when you start to see these things happen, you know that eventually they're going to reach that point. In the mid 2000s, between 2004 2008, of course, we had the financial collapse, the great financial crisis.
Right.
That led into what we really were moving on borrowed time. That was a turning point. They were able to kick the can down, but now we're into a new portion, which is the crisis state.
We are
The crisis
there.
state it goes from about 2005 to about 2025. And what do we see? We see financial undermining. We see the U.S. empire falling apart, whether it was Afghanistan, the pullout, whether it's the inability to deal with Russia over Ukraine, whether it's the inability of the U.S. to deal with Israel and Palestine.
Exactly.
The empire is suddenly seen to have no clothes. The emperor has no clothes. We are also moving into a new financial side with China, Russia, the BRICS nations, a number of different organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union. It's moving away from the dollar unipolar reserve currency world into the multipolar world. So the empire is collapsing. And this is something that happens in the first and second decades of every century, or nearly every century. Let's go back and take a look at some examples. The sack of Rome was in 412 AD by the Goths. This wouldn't lead instantaneously to the end of the Roman Empire, but within 50 years, it was done and the Dark Ages came. Then we had in the 18th century, 1704 to 1715, the secession of the War of Spanish Succession. And we're not talking the Spaniards having a civil war. At that time, the Habsburg Empire ruled over most of Europe. So that civil war took place, and it changed. As a matter of fact, a lot of historians refer to the War of Spanish Succession from 1701 to 1714 as the first modern world war, because it had campaigns that took place in Spain, Italy, Germany, as well as on the sea. So while we refer to what happened in 1914, 1918 as World War I, the War of Spanish Succession really was a global war because Europe had colonies all around the world, and they pulled in some of their colonies to fight for them in the war. So it was a global touched war. Then, of course, in the 19th century, 1800s, we had the Napoleonic Wars. 1900s, we had World War I. And here in 2020, we are starting to see things crack as the rise of Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the multipolar world is ending the empire, the U.S. hegemonic empire.
Oh. Do you perceive that we're going to be in another war, world war?
If I was to look at things in a totally objective point, the only way we would get into a global war is if the U.S. and Europe decide to attack. Neither China, Russia, the Middle East, or that want war. Russia did not want to get involved in Ukraine. The Maidan coup, the attempted genocide on the ethnic Russians in the Donbass and the Donetsk forced Russia to do this. But once that happened, of course, you see something also happen with empires. When domestic problems start to crop up, and we're talking going back to 2008 and the global financial crisis that we haven't fully recovered from. Europe went through the same thing. They create crises and they create bogeyman enemies to try to turn the perspective from inward at your government and look at the enemy from without. And this is what they've been doing, trying to say, Russia this, China this, China that. That's
and
usually
it's a bogeyman, like you said.
Right.
It isn't real.
And the problem is that people, if they do not look for the signs, for the events, for the things that stand out, and recognize that even the smallest things during the crisis stage can have lasting effects of a new world order. If you think about it, the crisis stage is the end of empire and the rise of a new order. And we haven't even talked about the cycles. We don't have to go into them. But in the past, the East China, the Mongolian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic Empire. Those were all world powers while Europe was in the Dark Ages. The U.S. hadn't even been discovered yet. So things go in a pendulum from east to west, west to east over the course of time.
Oh, wow.
And besides the 100-year cycles or the 20-year cycles that we do, we haven't even touched upon the 500-year cycle of colonialism. From 1492 to the present, the West has dominated the world.
Yes.
That is coming to an end. So we're getting the end of the U.S. hegemonic empire, the end of European control, the end of colonialism, where we're getting kicked out of Afghanistan, we're getting kicked out of Africa, we may leave Syria real quick. All of the Europe and that are giving up their colonies, and it's rising into the multipolar world.
So is this pendulum now swinging from the power of the West going east now?
Yes.
That is and you know, most people talk about how in many things, especially they talk about morality or politics or whatever, that the pendulum swings. It goes to an extreme and then it stops and it starts coming back into a sane place, but then it continues swinging the other way. That's part of the repeating pattern that this vibration causes. And well, you know, we live in, as the rabbis used to say, may you live in interesting times. No, I don't want to live in interesting times, but here we are. And we may very well be the terminal generation on the earth, because the collapse of the American empire, it's also the collapse of the empire that took Christianity to the world. And maybe the days are numbered that on the earth until we, you know, the Messiah comes. I hope that's true. I really do hope that this Laodicean era that we're living in is coming to an end soon, and that we will be raptured, taken to a safe place. And then what do you suppose is going to happen on the earth then? I mean, it's going to be the collapse of everything. But you talk about a new world order. That's prophesied, isn't it? So we're at the brink of that. Ken, I want to thank you so much. I've been fascinated by your work. Ken is the author of several books, including The Israel Deception, The Journey Distilled, which is his own testimony on becoming a believer. It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. It's your footprint into the kingdom. And he's written some other books too, which I will put links to down below. And I hope you will check them out. Ken, as things progress and you observe some more repeating patterns, I would really appreciate it if you get back in touch with us, and we'll have you back on.